All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Please use the chat to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're joining us from. If you're new to CCL, if you have a role within CCL, something that you're working with, that you're excited about in your chapter. If you're associated with any other organization, please let us know and tell us what brings you into this webinar today. My name is Solemi Hernandez. I am Citizens Climate Lobby Southeast Regional Director. My work is to support volunteers organizing to build political will in Florida, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. I'm joining today from Naples, Florida. And I am here today because this is a very important election, and we want to put climate change and the environment at the center of the voters when they go and choose their candidates. So I'm really excited to what Marvin and Stephanie have to say with these great campaigns and all the tools we have to get people voting for the right people that is going to do the right thing for our environment and our climate. So take it away, Marvin, and please continue introducing yourself in the chat.
Thank you, Salemi. Hi, everyone. My name is Marwan Mikdadi. I'm a Citizens Climate Lobby volunteer. I go to school at University of Michigan. I'm a rising third-year student studying economics. And I've been a part of Citizens Climate Lobby for a few years now, since about 2021. And this campaign, the Be the Climate Goat, Get Out the Climate Vote initiative, was something that I had the idea for a while now. And so this is an initiative that's being collaborated on between the Higher Ed team and National Youth Action Team of CCL, the Youth Action Team being the high school student group and the Higher Ed group being the college student group. The director of which is Stephanie, who is here with us today, has been a huge partner and help and the overall, supervisor for this with me. So the primary goals and major aims of this campaign are to persuade existing voters to prioritize climate change as an issue when voting, as well as mobilize voters who already care about climate change, but they aren't currently planning on voting. Volunteers also recruit some of the people they talk to as volunteers themselves to have the process repeat itself, where they reach out to people they know. This is our take on a tactic called relational organizing. But we're also blending this with deep canvassing tactics. So here is an overview of the steps that go into our approach when talking with voters. So we're focused on getting voters to hone in on the emotional stakes of climate change based on their personal experiences with climate to emphasize the stakes of getting people elected who will deal with the problem. So the first step of the script that we've created is seeing where a voter ranks climate change as a voting issue on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most important, 1 being the least important. Following this, we go to step 2, where we share a story. We ask the voter to share a story about how climate change has impacted them. In step 3, we make the case by sharing our own story to connect to the power to affect change by voting for people who care about solving the issue of climate change. Step 4 is processing conflict and addressing any lingering concerns that the voter may have. Then we ask them the starting question again to see how they think about the issue now. In typical CCL fashion, we end with gratitude and the ask, where we offer to share resources to help them in their decision-making and ask them to join the campaign. And right now, we are actually crafting a voting guide, which will allow people to have a way of knowing what to look for in candidates without directly endorsing anyone. And here is just a preview of the script that we'll go into in more depth later with Stephanie. But as you see, we have the steps themselves labeled along with pro tips on the side. These are things that are not directly read, but instead help you in the actual conversation itself. So, how is the campaign going so far? There have been over 700 interactions or conversations by our volunteers, including 475 conversations since the beginning of April when we launched our script and the Triple April Challenge. We've also had around nearly 3,000 overall contacts incorporated into our network, and 160 volunteers signed up. On average, completed conversations move people up by 1 point on a scale of 1 to 10 as far as how voters rated climate change as an important issue for them. This is still a work in progress, of course, and part of the process is fine tuning and adjusting as we go along. So we're working on making changes to become even more effective in terms of the number of voters we persuade, reach, and how much we're able to persuade them. And we are actually about to update the script very soon. So for getting involved, the easiest way to get involved with the campaign is to join it directly through the Empower app. And I will also paste these links in the chat once I'm finished, so don't worry about that. But again, you can join through the Empower app where volunteers log the number of conversations they have, as well as how the conversations themselves turn out. We're really focused on getting young voices. I'm not sure if there's any students in this call, but if you are a middle, high school, or college student, you can join by visiting cclusa.org/bethegoat. Or if you know students, you can pass this along to them, or we do have allied volunteers as well. From there, you'll receive instructions in the app to help you start talking to people on your contact list. And for your convenience, the script is linked as well within the app as a support should you need it and guiding your conversations with friends and family. Then you'd log the outcomes of your conversations into the app. And if you have any further questions about the campaign, you can reach out to the team, which includes me, as well as the youth action team members, Shamant Gowda and Druhi Patel. And you can reach us at electionscouncil@citizensclimatelobby.org or send us feedback at cclusa.org/goat feedback. And now I'll stop the presentation and I will hand it over now to Stephanie, and I'll also share some of these links in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marwan. What you just heard in 5 minutes is the product of like 2.5 years of research by Marwan, getting it down to being that concise to explain the concepts of relational organizing and deep canvassing has really been a ton of work, and truly has been student-led. So I just want to continue to amplify and uplift how impressive this campaign has been since its inception and since its origin. So what I want to do today is walk you through the script. Obviously, we're blending a lot of different tactics with the relational organizing and deep canvassing. And what that is kind of intentionally doing is putting us into a position where we're having conversations with people that we already know. Now, that's really typical of relational organizing. That is the foundation of it. It is really rare in deep canvassing. You're normally having a conversation with complete strangers and trying to forge an emotional bond with somebody you've never spoken to before, very much like a traditional phone banking might be, where you do that form of canvassing. So we are leveraging the fact that young people already have this emotional connection with some of the people in their lives and building upon that emotion by shifting their attention towards climate and how emotionally connected younger people are to climate change. So you'll see that reflected in the script. It's going to be written from the perspective of a younger voice. But tonight you're all going to have an opportunity to practice using the script. So of course you'll be making your own adaptations and making it sound right for you. But I just wanted to give that caveat before we jump into it because it is written to be read by students. And of course, it is also merely a guideline. So everybody's welcome to adapt it to the type of relationship they have with the person they're speaking to. So Marwan already gave you a pretty good orientation overall as to where things are in the script. You can see reminders of each of the steps in a typical deep canvassing conversation and where they come up. But I also really want to flag this table of contents in this section of potential conflicts and how to respond is definitely one of the spaces where we have worked the hardest and have also had to iterate the most. One of the both challenges and opportunities of trying to run a deep canvassing campaign as CCL is that we are, of course, a nonpartisan organization. Most deep canvassing campaigns have a very particular ballot initiative or candidate that they are trying to convince people to vote for. In this case, we're not trying to convince people to vote for any particular person because we are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. Instead, we are trying to convince people to connect their head to their hearts and their hearts to their hands at the ballot box, as Catherine Hayhoe would ask. So this section on potential conflicts obviously is always being iterated upon, and I invite you all to give us feedback. Also, if you do think that there are some conflicts that you've already heard in your conversations around the election that we're not representing here, that might come up in conversation. And I'll show you in more detail what those sections look like in just a moment. All right, so we did also want to acknowledge that there are different types of voters and different types of relationships between a voter and climate. So this script focuses on likely voters who just aren't prioritizing climate. Because again, we're trying to get people to move climate up on their list. Like many of you have probably seen surveys that they've done of the electorate, and they ask, what are your top 3 voting issues that you're thinking about this year? It's almost always things like the economy. It might be reproductive rights. Often there are things that hit you directly in your pocketbook or hit you directly in your heart, in your emotions. Climate almost always ends up really low on that list because for many people, it's not yet hitting them in their pocketbooks and it's not something that they're emotionally connected to. So we want to reach the people who are already likely to cast a vote, but might be only thinking about their pocketbook or some of these other emotional issues, and make sure that climate is just as emotional and meaningful to them. So in the beginning, as Marwan said, this is the conversation starter, and we ask them for the first rating. This is a really great example of a section where people might, will obviously adapt it to reflect the relationship they already have. We're dealing with young people, so a lot of the young people in our campaign are having these conversations over text or Snapchat or not having a conversation in person. So obviously it looks and feels and sounds really differently in those different contexts. Admittedly, because of those different contexts, it's also sometimes hard to just get started. That's what the pro tip here focuses on. The first thing we want to do is ask them if they're even open to a conversation, and ask them an initial question that is not loaded, relatively straightforward. Admittedly, even a question as simple as, are you planning to vote, can be emotionally and politically charged, but we need to ask it anyways. Then we ask a follow-up question about whether or not the government should take more action to reduce the impacts of climate change on people. We ask them what they think about that. And the whole goal with the deep canvassing conversation, as the name implies, is to get deep. We're opening up a lot of space for them to share very real, sometimes complicated and difficult to manage emotions and responses. So we want to give them plenty of space to answer that question. And then we're going to ask them on a 1 to 10 scale, where does climate change and climate action rank in terms of issues you consider important when voting and deciding upon candidates? This is that ranking question that Marwan mentioned. If you're a 10 on that scale, you are a climate champion. And you'll see right here, right underneath that scale, we provide guidance for volunteers on how to respond to people anywhere on the spectrum. If they are a 10, we don't really need to convince them to make climate a priority or to help them see their emotional connection to climate change and climate action. They're already there. We've already got a climate champion, so we're asking our volunteers to use this as an opportunity to recruit them to join the campaign and have conversations like these themselves. However, if they're not a 10, even if they're a 9, it's helpful to understand what's the thing that's holding you back from being a 10, and let's focus our conversation there. If they're a 5, what's below the 5? What's above the 5? What are the things that are helping them land right in the middle? And especially trying to figure out what those potential sources of conflict can be, because it's helpful to have that in mind. Then we have some transition information. And like I said, we're working with young people. So for our youth team participants who are under the age of 18, for the most part, they're not eligible to vote yet. So we're using this as an opportunity for them to really lean into the fact that they don't have the opportunity yet to vote, but they are still really passionate about this issue and calling upon the older people in their lives who care about them to use their voice and keep them in mind. Then we have our college students, who many are already eligible to vote. Many of their friends and people they might be speaking with in this campaign are already eligible to vote, and they're going to perhaps be voting for the first time themselves in this election. So they can speak really powerfully to the power of democracy and voting and participating in that way. All right, so that is step one. It genuinely flies by, but I wanted to make sure to give everybody all of this context, because this is where we start to build that relationship. In step two, we are story sharing. And we'll ask them again, we're constantly asking them to open up. We're asking them for an invitation also for us to open up. So we'll ask them if they've seen pollution or climate change making an impact on their life or the lives of other people that they care about. Sometimes what we found in these conversations, some people haven't seen that impact yet. Remember what I said earlier, climate hasn't been something that has hit a lot of people in the pocketbook or in the heart yet. So if they say no, that can be an opportunity for our volunteers to share their climate change impact story. It's also an opportunity to bring up things that you know matter to that person. So if you're speaking to your buddy who you know because you like to go to baseball games together, you know he cares about sports. Maybe he doesn't think that climate has anything to do with his passion for sports. But as many of us on this call likely know, increasingly training seasons, actual game seasons are being canceled because it is literally unsafe for our athletes to be out on the field because of climate change. So you can share something about like your experiences, or how you were impacted because you had bought tickets for this game, or you had bought season tickets, and your team just really didn't do well because they didn't get a lot of time to practice because we're in Florida and their practice got disrupted by extreme storms or extreme heat. And then you can ask them again, have you seen any impacts like these? And you might find that their answer has changed because you reminded them of the many different ways that climate change can show up in our lives. We provide tips for people, for our volunteers to craft their climate impact stories. Of course, everyone's story looks different, feels different, but stories in deep canvassing are really effective when they emphasize how those experiences made you feel. They're full of very descriptive language, like this is the time to pull out all of your literary tendencies and to tell a very floral and visual story. They acknowledge your own conflict, the ways, maybe the challenges that you encountered on the way to discovering that you were a climate advocate yourself, and how you're working through some of that cognitive dissonance you have inside. And they should be about people. Unfortunately, I'm an ecologist by training. I have told many climate stories about penguins and birds and reptiles and all sorts of really cool critters that I'm very passionate about. And most of the people I have told those stories to did not become climate advocates themselves because the stories weren't about people. This is why it's really valuable to make those stories personal and about your experience and the experience of your loved ones. This is also an opportunity to remind them about how government climate action has already had a positive impact. A lot of people have benefited from rebates and deductions after the Inflation Reduction Act. Maybe you have a good story about how you've used some of that funding to electrify your home, or to get a new electric vehicle because it became more affordable with those tax incentives. And then we want to transition into making the case. And in this case, we want to remind them what we just told them and then tell them what we're going to tell them, right? Very traditional public speaking skills. Remind them that you just told them how climate change is impacting your life, and call back to their story. That's really powerful. If they had a climate change story, remind them of what they literally just told you about that hurricane that flooded their home and they lost everything. Remind them of that. Or a call back to your story, especially if you have something that's particularly relevant and powerful. And remind them that that moment was one of those situations that made you realize how important it was to have the right elected officials in office. And for you as a champion yourself to do something about climate change and climate action. And you can again reference some of the positive changes you've made. Maybe you have decided to have a more plant-based diet as a result of your concern for the climate. but realize that all of those small changes we're making in our individual lives are nothing compared to government scale action. And to do that, we have to vote, and we have to vote for the right people. Now, regardless of how your conversation has gone to this point, there will be conflict, more than likely. They will likely say, well, yeah, that's all good and well, and I would love to not have extreme hurricanes impacting my life here in Florida, but I have a truck and I need a truck for work, and I can't imagine a world where you don't have fossil fuels. And this is just going to impact my pocketbook. It's going to become too expensive. And this is where we get into the processing conflict section. This is a section that takes the most time because most of these are really deeply held values and beliefs. You can't combat that with facts, or at least not with facts alone. You have to combat that by getting down to the deeper value underneath. And we have some examples of those potential conflicts. So I'll scroll down to some of these. For example, what I just gave was a concern around impacts on livelihoods. If they are concerned that taking meaningful national level climate action is going to impact the economy, then you want to first acknowledge and validate that concern. That's a very real, healthy concern. Some climate actions would be really disastrous for our economy. And as another person who is living in this economy, you also care about your economic future, and you want your economy to be healthy. So you can, especially for our younger people, they're thinking long term. They're thinking about their capacity to like own a home, to start a family, to have a meaningful career. And then remind them that there are pathways that don't have to destroy the economy. There are really good common sense climate solutions that elected officials could pass that would actually stimulate the economy. And of course, because we are CCL, this would be a really good opportunity to remind them of things like a carbon fee and dividend that would help to mitigate some of those concerns that they already have. But you're not starting with, let me tell you about my favorite climate solution. You're starting with, let me tell you about the hope that I have for my life that is literally in jeopardy if we don't take action. All right, so that is the processing conflict section. In step 5, we're going to be wrapping up our conversation and asking them the same question that we asked them at the beginning about where they're ranking climate change and climate action, again on that same 1 to 10 scale. And as Marwan mentioned, ideally we want to see them go up a couple of points. If you've had a really good conversation, they might even jump up from a 5 to an 8 or 9. That's a really powerful one. And then the last part is probably the easiest, most natural part, except when you've had a difficult conversation and they haven't moved on the scale. It can be really challenging to be grateful in those situations, right? Like when we have a difficult meeting with a member of Congress, but it is really important to still thank them for their time. They took time to hear you out, you took time to hear them out and connect. So we want to make sure we thank them first and then ask them if they're interested in some voter resources, if they're interested in learning more about an action they can take right in that moment. We always have opportunities to call members of Congress and tell them as a constituent why it's important that they take a certain climate action. So you can invite the person you're speaking to call their member of Congress right then and there with you and tell them that they really care about this action. And as Marwan mentioned, if they are a student or are a climate champion at the end of this conversation, consider recruiting them into the campaign. All right, so that is a general, well, that's a pretty detailed, let me not call that general, pretty detailed rundown of the script. I know that was a huge amount of information, and I did see there were some messages coming in the chat as I was speaking, so I'll try to catch up with that. But while I do, I was wondering if, Marwan, could you share the slide that you have that has the 6 steps of the deep canvassing conversation? Because I'd love for folks to take a look at that and then put in the chat which of the 6 steps you feel like you would need the most help with, like just knowing what's in them already. Where do you feel like you might struggle the most? Just take a minute and let us know in the chat if you were concerned about step 1, step 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6.
Also, one thing I would like to add, going back to what Stephanie mentioned, sometimes you talk to people about climate change and they say, there's not really a specific experience that stands out for them. It can also be, do you know people who it's important to, especially, uh, maybe older folks who have grandchildren. If those people bring up those people, I mean, grandkids, younger people that people know, they care about the issue. You can mention this is something, I know young people in my life, this is very important for them. And because it's important for them, it's important for me. And, maybe another person who's in a similar situation can get that and they can see that perspective. So it doesn't always have to be pure experience. It can just be, this is something that's important to me because it's important to somebody else who I care about, if that makes sense.
And that's definitely part of why we've designed our campaign, mostly thinking about younger people speaking to like their parents or grandparents, because you are the person that they care about, who cares deeply about climate change and who has been impacted by it. Great. Thank you all so much. I really love asking this question because we're all different. We all get anxious at different points in our social interactions. So as you can see in the chat, there is a big range. Several of you who are worried about just getting started in a conversation, a lot of nervousness around step 4, where you're processing the conflict. That totally makes sense. Most of us are conflict avoidant. Many of us are, at least. Or kind of socialized and trained to avoid that, right? So it's a little bit weird to put yourself in a situation where you're going to have to actually talk about it. But we're going to use good tactics to talk about it in a way that is respectful and conducive to connecting on an emotional level. Let's see. Story sharing also. Yeah, that can be a little scary, especially if you're sharing a story that's very intimate and personal. Opening up can be terrifying. It's valid. Keeping up the conversation, yes. We do have quite a few conversations on the Empower app that were started and didn't quite make it to the end. It happens to everybody. And sometimes it's important to stop a conversation when it's not going in a good direction. That's something you'll also learn from deep canvassing experts. Like if somebody was a 1 or a 2 when you started the conversation and they start being aggressive towards you, you shouldn't be putting yourself in harm's way to have a conversation either. You really want to talk to people who are open to it. Again, why we're mostly talking to friends and family members. Okay. Yeah, Marwan.
Oh, just one thing I wanted to add is, yes, that is something, that can be a big difficulty, is how do you keep the conversation on track? Sometimes there's a lot of things that can really deviate it. And one thing I found in my experience and the experience of other volunteers and people in deep canvassing organizations is it helps to have kind of like a boogeyman, if you will, basically something that is being pushed back against. And in this case, that can be, corporate interests or, the fossil fuel industry as a whole. Having something to think about, we need to vote because there are interests out there that are counter to mine, that if I don't vote, they will have a say in this election. And it's sort of about people power first, people power versus corporate power. That's one possible, conflict that you can center the conversation on. And even if things deviate, as long as you can keep it on track to that, something that really resonates with people, hey, almost a sort of populism, if you will, that can be very helpful. And at least I found.
Yeah, it's a really great point, Marwan. And Lynn kind of asked a related question about how to handle it if someone makes it specifically political during the conversation. We're talking about elections. They will. They absolutely will, because that's how our brain is programmed and socialized to talk about elections. We talk about it in the context of political parties and candidates and positions and platforms. So I don't know, Marwan, if you would like to share some of what you've learned or heard from other deep canvassing campaigns that is effective or a good way to get that conversation back on track and back into that nonpartisan space.
So it has a lot to do kind of with what I mentioned earlier, is saying, hey, it's not really, don't think about it from this partisan lens, Democrat, Republican, just think about it from people power and climate power, dealing with climate first. And that's not, you don't really want to bring the partisan lens into it, of course, because we're C3. And so it's essentially just about the stakes, if you will. If we don't have people in office who care about the issue, if we don't have policies that can get passed, there are real communities and real lives at stake. And so it's important to just focus on who will deal with the issue. If that's kind of a general piece of advice, I guess I would give for those situations when people do make it, more partisan. And I've had conversations with volunteers and they report that. But having, again, just like a conflict that is not partisan to recenter and refocus on can help with that, hopefully.
And as with all of the things that Marwan and I are talking about tonight, there are organizations out there that are specifically focused on deep canvassing, like the Deep Canvassing Institute, that will have entire trainings on something that we're trying to answer in just one question in 2 minutes. So if you are very interested, there are entire trainings on how to redirect the deep canvassing conversation that's gone astray. And we'd be happy to share resources and links to those other organizations. Yeah, and if I think this would be a good opportunity if folks have any other questions. I saw Martha has a question in the chat as well, or a comment in the chat that finding a conversation can be hard. To get someone started on personal stories and to keep ideas open without judgment is important. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's part of why in some deep canvas trainings, especially on topics that are very personal, you're actually advised to share your story first, rather than soliciting the other person's story. You share yours first, and you, like, being open and sharing, expressing that vulnerability helps to break some of those walls down. In this case, because we are generally asking young people to speak with the older people in their lives, maybe parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, ideally there's a relationship there that is already comfortable with some vulnerability. So we feel confident that you can ask for that story and pull more vulnerability out if you find that you're getting a pretty flat, superficial story. But you can ask them to share first and then build from there. You folks have any other questions about the campaign or the script? I believe people are able to unmute or raise their hands if they'd like to. Yeah.
Stephanie, and Marwan and Solemi, I love this training. I have a question as an older adult. What tips do you have for us? Anything that you can, project in your minds another few decades onto your young selves? And
I think what I mentioned before with talking about if you're talking to people who are, also older folks, mentioning, hey, I have, I know young people, or I have family, I have, grandchildren, whatever it may be. And if they also have that situation with them, that helps mirror it, if that makes sense. You're able to project that same feeling of, even if this isn't as, directly impacting me, it still impacts people I care about just the same as it does you, and it's important to them, so it's important to me. And then that person can hopefully feel the same way. So it doesn't always have to be, like I said, experiential. It can be, it's still, as long as it's still personal, if that makes sense.
I'll say probably in this room with a lot of CCLers, many of you have probably heard the story of Bob Inglis and what got him to take action on climate. And it was a conversation with a younger person in his life who was really deeply meaningful to him. So the previous example the previous collaborative campaign and project that the Higher Ed Action Team and Youth Action Team worked on was actually an intergenerational conversations campaign and project and resource. And the person that we were working with from AARP also got inspired by hearing Bob Inglis's story. And he actually had a similar conversation with his daughter, where he solicited, like, is this your experience too? And she said, absolutely. I've been trying to tell you this for 10 years, Dad. And it was like the kick in the pants that he really needed to get started. So I feel like it seems like it's fake when I, as a student engagement director, say it's lean on young people. But they're such powerful messengers for climate. And I think many of the people that you might speak to, many of your peers, will have somebody younger than them in their lives who has had this conversation or had this experience with them. And even if they haven't had it, when you talk to them, they may end up going and asking their niece or their son if this resonates for them too, and discovering that maybe they just weren't listening all that time. Great. Any other questions?
So yeah, I have one suggestion or question about the script. Or at the beginning it says, and I got to get to it. I'm really worried about what my future might be like. Well, you know, as you know, some of us don't have as much future as others. So I'm wondering if a better way to say it would be, you know, I'm worried about your future. Start it like that.
Yeah, certainly if you were having a conversation with a younger person in your life, it would make sense to change that to, I'm worried about your future. Or I've heard that a lot of young people are struggling with imagining a future for themselves in a changing climate. In this case, again, like the script is written from the perspective of being read by a younger person. So that's why we leaned in a little bit more into the my future piece, because they're likely going to be speaking to that, you know, grandmother or grandfather, and really want to emphasize how their ability to think about the future is going to look really different from how it looked for them 40 years ago. But that's a great example of an adaptation that I would love for you to test out when you guys go into breakout rooms in just a moment. I just want to make sure that we've addressed any comments in the chat. Perfect. Yeah.
And please go to the chat too and click on the link so you can record your attendance to this workshop. Thank you. Let me know when you are ready.
Yes, I think we are ready. Just make sure you've all clicked on that link that Marwan just put in the chat for the script if you didn't already have it open. So you're gonna have about 15 minutes in breakout rooms with one other person. The reason I asked you to reflect on the step that you feel most uncomfortable with is that obviously you're not going to get through an entire conversation in 15 minutes. And certainly you won't both get to practice being the volunteer in just 15 minutes and run the whole conversation. So what we typically recommend is having both of you practice being the volunteer and being the voter. So you're going to alternate, switch off about halfway through. It's helpful to practice step one, just getting the words out and starting the conversation and asking the ranking question. And then I would recommend you spend the rest of your half of the time before you switch, jumping ahead to that step that you're most uncomfortable with. And if it is, for example, the process conflict step, maybe you want to just tell the person, we're going to skip ahead to step 4. Come up with whatever conflict you think you might encounter in your conversations, and you're going to adapt based on what you're given by your role play partner. So it'll be a good model for how a real conversation might go, because you're never quite sure where people will land. So does that make sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I think we can send people off into breakout rooms.
And if you have any questions, please let us know. You have an option to raise your hand and we can go to your breakout room, and we'll be here on the main room for you guys. So have fun. Open all the doors.
Welcome back, everybody. And there are still a few people in breakout rooms wrapping up their conversations. So we'll give them just another about 30 seconds to get back in here. And we're excited to hear from you about how it went, any questions, feedback. Marwan already shared the form where you can give us some feedback directly. So if you don't get to it on the call live, you can submit a little feedback form for us. And just 3 more seconds. Okay. I think we got everybody back. We didn't lose anybody to cyberspace or clicking the leave meeting button instead of leave room. So thank you all so much for practicing and trying that out. I am really excited to hear your feedback, but unfortunately I'm going to have to hear it in a recording because I have to go run another CCL call. But Marwan is going to be here and taking notes and on everything you share with us. Thank you so much for doing that exercise, and I can't wait to hear all about it in the recording, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions ever.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so has anything they want to talk about? How did it all go for you? And any suggestions you would give, things that maybe aren't touched upon in the script. Just any general feedback, and feel free to write it in the chat, or you can raise your hand, and you can or just say it aloud. Oh, I think I just saw Martha Turner. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, Lisa and I exchanged, we're from different parts of the world. We have different issues. So we had some fun really debating what the worst things are that are going on in our areas against the climate debate. Anyways, we got exchanged quite a bit. And then we exchanged emails because we're going to work at trying to figure out different approaches that we can talk to people about climate issues. And she had a special one about certain type of people that are how they're driven by their Christian values, that they're more MAGA looking at things. And I told her that we have to look at the boomer things that are going on with the boomers that are set in their ways. So we're going to talk back and forth after all of this. But thank you for introducing us all to each other. Thank you, Marlon.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's very nice to hear, that you had that connection. Did you have any insights? I mean, did you use the script at all in your discussion, or is there anything that you find was useful from it, or maybe wasn't useful enough?
It was kind of hard to refer back to the script. I had it, maybe I came in a couple of minutes late, but I printed it up, and I forgot to, I worked with Chris in Seattle. I'm on the East Coast, he's on the West Coast, and I forgot to thank him for talking to me.
Okay, that's good.
But we had a good conversation about the kinds of individuals that we would encounter because of our different circumstances. In Seattle, they've got the smoke to deal with, and in the East Coast, we've got a lot of hurricanes that we're contending with. So, and basically, I don't know, I guess Chris started out a 9. He's probably still a 9.
That's okay.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention, and yeah, Libby, it was great to talk to you, was about the people, and I was talking to someone just this weekend who basically challenged the economic impact of addressing climate change, that basically it was going to make his life more expensive. And because it was going to cost him more to heat his home, and in this state especially, gas prices have gone through the roof, which are being blamed on the Climate Commitment Act. Not true, but that's the narrative that's out there. And so I was just looking at the script. I see there is a section on here about what to say when people say, I think climate action will impact the economy. So I will read that and study it, but I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's certainly a big rebuttal. That's very policy specific. People say, climate policy, like, perhaps something that we advocate for at CCL, like a carbon fee and dividend, that will make everything much more expensive. But that's not something that's innate to climate policy. There are ways that can be dealt with that, like with the carbon fee and dividend. You redistribute money back to the people that helps them cope with those higher prices, as opposed to a situation where you have now where you can have high gas prices, but you don't get any rebate or anything to deal with that. There's no government public involvement in that sense, and so that's something where the price is purely it's much more fluctuating in that sense. It's vulnerable to geopolitical events like we see with the Russia-Ukraine war or with OPEC, as opposed to tying it down to something, as well as transitioning us off of something that's that volatile. Oh, I see. Yes. If any of you have to go, feel free. I believe it is past time anyway. But thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
It was my pleasure to talk to you and to get all of your feedback. I'll stay on for a couple more minutes if any of you still want to give feedback. But if you have to leave, but you still want to offer feedback, feel free. If you scroll up to my last message, and I'll paste it again, I have a feedback form, and Salemi will also send out the slides that will have all the relevant links. But if you have any feedback, please feel free to use the form. Yes, it was great talking to you all and great presenting this to you.
Thank you.